Hey, welcome to Taylor's Trick Taking Table. I'm Taylor, and here we are for part 2, or should I do part 2 of the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring trick taking game. That's right. Please check out part 1. This will make way more sense if you see part 1. Part 1 did the short victory teach and a playthrough of the first 5 chapters. And this will do a short teach of the long victory and also what you do after you play through the whole game. So like the post-campaign gameplay, a little short teach on that as well. And then we're going into a developer diary, which I talk about the development on the game, working with Office Dog and the amazing designer Brian Bornmuller on this game. No final thoughts because huge bias, obviously. And also, I wanted to say this is releasing at PAX Unplugged this December. So come on, swing by, grab a copy. It's so close. I can't wait for y'all to play it and let me know what you think. So many fun reveals and plays. That loud horn is a sign that it is time to go to the teach. Thank you so much for watching. It definitely is so wild that this is out and that I'm making a video or two on this wonderful, wonderful game. Whew. Without further ado, off to the table. All right, see you there. Here we have the game set up for a long chapter. This is chapter 13, The Ring Goes South. The entire fellowship is here, so you're going to have a bunch more characters. As you can see, I've actually flipped them, so less spoilers. You don't actually know what they do, their goals or their setup, but we have pretty much Legolas, Gimli, Bill the Pony, Aragorn, and Boromir here. Frodo has a mithril shirt, which is part of the setup. It says you don't have to complete Build the Pony, but ignore that. I'll explain that later. But as you can see, now there's a new victory of finish all the characters and also a new threat deck. So in the short victory, if you remember, you would select characters, you would draft them after looking at your hand, where Frodo would be the character with the one ring, and then you would draft down the line. But now you have to finish all of the characters except for Build the Pony, which is noted here. So the differences here is there still will be a character with an asterisk. That is Frodo in here. In this case, that means Frodo is going to be used in every single hand. So every time you deal out and play a hand of the game, you will use Frodo. That will always go to the player with the one ring. They'll get their mithril shirt, which I'm also still covering, so I don't have enough spoilers. And then how it works is similar to the short victory, is players will look at their hands, they'll draft a character. Maybe this person thinks they have a good Merry hand, maybe this person thinks they have a good Boromir hand, and lastly, this person thinks they have a good Sam hand. You would still do the setup. So Frodo would do their setup, Merry, Boromir setup, Sam setup. And what's interesting now is it says draw from the threat card. Threat cards are now 1 through 7, so it's a little bigger. You would shuffle those and you would draw. And now Sam would need to get the 7 of Hills. So those characters would be set aside. You would play a hand. And similar to the short game, everyone would need to satisfy their goal. So Merry needs 1 or 2 tricks. Boromir needs to do whatever Boromir does. And then Sam needs to capture the 7 of Hills. After that is done, you're going to put all the completed... So if you fail any goal, you've lost. You've lost the entire chapter. But if you win every goal, you're going to take all the completed characters. You're going to put them off to the side like this. Then you're going to get all the cards back again, the lost card, every single card. You're going to shuffle, re-deal out the cards. The person with the one ring is going to be Frodo again. Then you're going to draft characters again. And the goal here is you have to finish every character. So now we're looking at it, and so the player's looking at their hand, they're like, oh, maybe now I have a good Aragorn hand. This person's like, oh, I have a good Pippin hand. And then this person's like, oh, I have a really good Gimli hand. You would play again. And then you would try to satisfy all the goals. If you failed any of those 4 goals, you lose the entire chapter. But if you satisfy those goals, again, these characters would go over into the completed pile. You'd shuffle, you'd redeal, and ideally, you would play another match where one player says, oh, I have a perfect Legolas hand. And this person goes, oh, I have a perfect Gandalf hand. And then this person goes, you know, I have a perfect Build a Pony hand, or even, you know, Gimli hand. You can pick previously done characters. In fact, you could, if you wanted to, pick 2 previously done characters and do another round with Boromir again, Sam again, but the only new one would be Legolas. The risky thing is if anybody in here doesn't satisfy their goal, like if Sam doesn't capture the 7 of Hills or whatever they needed to do, then you would lose the entire chapter. So it's a little risky to do characters that are already completed again, because you're playing a whole hand of the game where something could go wrong. So ideally, you'd want to grab every character that hasn't been completed, so like Gandalf in this case. But like I said at the start, Build a Pony doesn't need to be completed, so you could pick another one. So if you then, let me move these back into the completed section. If you then did this and you satisfied Gandalf and Legolas, who were the last two that didn't need to be completed, they would go over in the completed section and you have won a long. So what a long essentially is multiple rounds, multiple hands of the game until everyone's completed. You could do a ton of hands, you could keep replaying characters you've already done, but again, you're not progressing towards the goal. So you always want to capture, or you always want to draft a character that hasn't been completed yet, because you do need to finish all of them to be able to successfully win that chapter. So this chapter 13, you're playing 3 hands, usually, depending on the player count, and once you do that, where you complete them all successfully, then you will win the chapter and move on to, chapter 14. And that's how to play a long victory. How you play the game after you finish the campaign, you could just replay the campaign, for sure, or you could play the Road Goes Ever On mode. So after you finish all the chapters, you can keep playing. You're going to look at the bottom of the characters, and the characters will all have one of 3 at the very bottom of their card at the bottom right. We'll have one of 3 kind of types of boxes. So there's black, white, and then there's gold, this one down here. The gold ones you have not seen in our little spoilers, so I will not be showing those. But essentially how it works is you're going to get a certain amount of gold, a certain amount of black, and then you're also going to get the Gandalf and Frodo. So Gandalf and Frodo are going to be in every single game of The Road Goes Ever On, but then you're going to randomly shovel some gold, some black, and then you're going to play a long chapter with all these random characters. In addition, to make it harder, you're going to get a special Black Rider card, which I have not shown. Again, spoilers. And you're also going to get a special item card. One of them was the Mithril shirt, which I've already shown, covering up what it does. Again, as low spoilers as possible. You're going to get the deck, 1 through 7, and then you're going to play like a long chapter where you have to satisfy all the characters. But what's cool now is it's Frodo and Gandalf, and with a bunch of interesting collection of characters. So maybe it's Bilbo and Tom Bombadil with Farmer Maggot, and they're all playing together, so you get these interactions and combinations that weren't in the original game, in the original system, especially because you have special Black Riders and items. There's a lot of variability and different interesting interactions that you'll see in this mode. And that's how to play The Road Goes Ever On. So that is Lord of the Rings, A Fellowship of the Ring, trick-taking game. Huge bias, but of course we won't be doing a review, so not that much bias. We'll be doing a development diary. I worked on this game doing development for years, and what's interesting is I didn't do the full teach, and in this development diary I'll do my best to not spoil any of the fun reveals, because that is what they are. They're fun when they are revealed. I think watching when I was doing development, showing these twists and turns, you obviously know the story, but you don't know what's going to happen in the game itself. Showing that to people is the best. So I would not want to rob anyone who's watching this of that, so I will keep them hugely low. It'll be mostly whatever I've shown in the teach, and maybe things you could surmise just based on the premise of the game. So huge no / very low spoilers or reveals here. It was so amazing to work on. Brian is just outstanding and creative and dynamic and has so many wonderful ideas and knows how to put them all together. It was amazing. So maybe I'm jumping a little bit ahead. It all started when Brian, the designer, reached out over email and was like, do you want to do development on a trick-taking game? I said, yes, I would absolutely love to. And he said, oh, let's meet up at PAX Unplugged, because we were both going there. And what's great is actually this is now releasing at this PAX Unplugged, like I mentioned. So very cyclical, very fun. And we met up, and he's like, hey, so this is Lord of the Rings. And I was immediately already like, what? Lord of the Rings is huge. It's one of my favorite IPs, and everyone has a different relationship with Lord of the Rings. I didn't read the books growing up, but I remember when I was really young, my brother and sister had a sleepover, brought over a bunch of friends, and they were watching the Lord of the Rings movie, the first one, The Fellowship. And I remember my parents were like, you're too young for this. It's violent and it has war and evil, and so you have to go to your room. And classic kid, I snuck out and was like taking peeks at the screen, and I was like, fireworks, and like that scene where like Merry and Pippin run into Sam and Frodo. I'm like, this is great. What's wrong with this? I did get caught and I had to go back, so that's all I knew of Lord of the Rings growing up, until one of my friends had the PlayStation 2 Return of the King game, and I remember playing it and being like, this is so much fun, so amazing, I should just watch the movies. And so after that, I watched the movies, absolutely loved it, and loved it so much that I had been meaning to read the books for a long time. I have like a really long reading list that, as you could probably guess, just keeps getting added to, and it's just impossible. And so I've been meaning to read The Lord of the Rings for a super, super long time. So when Brian said it was Lord of the Rings, I thought movies, interestingly enough. But what was great was he was saying it's actually the books. And this was a perfect time to, like an impetus for me to read the books finally, which was so great. So actually, I, over the course of the development, got to read through all 3 of the books, and it was wonderful. There's, so many characters, and that's a little bit part of this. But there's so many different stories for different characters and different endings, and that was absolutely wonderful. So one of the most fun parts of the entire development was reading the Lord of the Rings books and seeing how they could whoops, dropped that. But reading the Lord of the Rings books and seeing how they could get translated into gameplay, and that idea there. I'm jumping way ahead. Oh my gosh. So, Brian and I at a sandwich shop in Philadelphia talking about the game. So he was like, yeah, so it's Lord of the Rings, it's cooperative, and it's trick-taking. And if you're familiar with the game Trick Takers, where essentially you get a hand of cards and you draft a character, it's essentially that. So I love that premise, and I was so interested in it. And if you've watched a little bit of the teach earlier in this video, the game was at that moment essentially like Chapter 13. How it was it was just like a single solitaire game. It was 3 or 4 hands or something, where you played as the Fellowship. So you played as Gimli, Legolas, Aragorn, Boromir, all the hobbits and Gandalf and stuff. And everyone would draft a character, you complete them, draft a different character, complete them, draft a different character, complete them. That was the game. That was it. So there was a deck of cards, just the characters. So it was kind of meant to be like just like a box of cards, right? Like not like this long 3-deck game. And so that's what it started out as. And part of the development, so I went to go play it, and the first thing that hit was like, this is a lot of goals, a lot of setup, and a lot of info coming at the players. A notable thing was players would be super excited to play, they'll sit down, and then there was just like a ton of text and like understanding and grokking what's going on. And so for example, like you sit down and be like, okay, Frodo needs these rings, Sam needs a specific hill, Pippin needs the fewest, Merry needs 1 or 2 tricks. But then you go through that for all of the characters, everyone in the Fellowship. And that was just like a lot for the players. And so the first part of the development was, I was like, well, is there a way we can slow roll this to players, like slowly feed them this information and these characters? Like, can we have an onboarding process? So Brian's like, oh yeah, that sounds great. So what we did was broke it down. So then that started the ball rolling into turning this into more of like a chapter-based scenario. So it went from like that just one game to now, okay, let's have like an onboarding process. And part of the discussion was, how long of an onboarding process, what do we want to do for that? So it started with just the simpler characters. And after that happened, then we added the other characters. And it was like a 3, 4, 5 like kind of chapter. It wasn't called chapters at the time, but like 3, 4, 5 sections of a game as you slowly got to that big game with Long and all the characters. So that was better for sure. Like once I was showing new players, it was like, oh, okay, yeah, like I'll learn these characters, then I'll learn those characters, then those characters, then we'll add them all at the end, and that will be a big, final thing. So it became actually more like a tutorial, and then you got to the game. So then at that point, it was starting to look a little bit to like how it is now, right? So like a little bit of like a linear structure. Then we were talking, and it became apparent that some of the things you could do with the game, like there's a lot you could do with the game, and there were a lot of characters. And a lot of the questions I would get were like, oh, is this character, you know, like you just start to see characters. And so then it became, we have the rights to the book, what if we just go through the book? And what's interesting is once you can go through the book, now you have a ton of characters. You can have a ton of things you can do. One of the worries of this, and I remember honing in on the number of chapters being a big thing, is because a common thing we talked about was like, the crew is very long. A lot of times people don't finish the crew. There's just like a lot of chapters. We did not want that. So we're going back and forth on how many is a good number, like 25, 20, like how do we break this down? And we use the book itself as a really good, I almost said bookmark, as a really good pacer. So it's not one-to-one, but that idea of like every chapter, or like the chapters being a guide of how many chapters or like rounds or, you know, games you'll play was really good. And then also what really helped was this idea of having, my friends made like a what is it called, 3D printed ring, which I keep in this box, which is fun because while there's a ring token, it's fun to give Frodo a little ring, and it's really awesome. Chris did this. It's like this. Oh, you can't really see the detail, but it's printed on it, the wording, right? But so another really interesting consideration when we were working on this game was having enough cards to fit in this kind of small box. We didn't want too big of a box because it's a trick-taking game, right? And there's like this production mentality of if you go buy a trick-taking game, it can't be like too big or too expensive. And so what we landed on was like this first section was going to have the deck, player aids, and the very first chapter. And then once you played that, it was like all good. And then the later ones were going to be in like these sections. So what was great was working within that limitation. I've mentioned on the channel before, just that idea of limitations help you be creative in an interesting way. Like I've talked to a lot of artists that I've worked with, and sometimes it's like, hey, could you make me art of like a raccoon? And it's like, oh yeah, I could, like any guidelines. And if you're just too loose, the artist is like, oh, I don't really know where to go. But if you're like, oh, could you make me a raccoon who is dancing on a tightrope and the vibe is actually kind of like a little clowny or silly? Like if you give more guidelines and like constraints, then it can like, creativity can flourish because then you kind of have like a good scope. So all that to say, when we knew how many cards we wanted and the size, that was also a really good indication of like how long should this game be. Also, the number of chapters, didn't want to go too long. Like I said before, we didn't want players to not finish it. That was a big thing. We didn't want it to be redundant. A lot of the development work was, is this chapter redundant? Is this chapter not interesting? Is this chapter, or conversely, is this chapter too big of a step? Sometimes we would have, we needed a middle step that wouldn't be, or that would be an easier transition for players. Like if something was too wild, because there are definitely some wild ideas in here. If something was too wild, do we want players to have an easier onboarding? And also, so I could talk openly about the first chapter, because even if you care about spoilers, you're definitely going to see the first chapter. So the first chapter, working on this one specifically, was so interesting. So you have 4 characters only. And this was fun because there's this idea in the game that if you have the characters equal number of players, it makes sense for the draft. Everyone gets a player. Obviously at 3 players, that doesn't really quite work. But we used to have 5 characters in here. And it was interesting because it was like, oh yeah, let's give players another choice. But even that idea of like, actually, let's just go to 4 players made things so much quicker. And then at 3 players, then you have, 2 leftover characters. So just small decisions like that are like, hey, if this was meant to be an onboarding, we want this to have as few choices as possible because the players are just trying to learn the game. And then also like what characters are in here. A lot of this was thematic, so Frodo, Bilbo, Gandalf. But then it was like, why Pippin, right? Because Pippin and Merry are both in the book, they're lighting off fireworks, and Sam's there, right? And so then it became, well, what's the character that's easiest to understand and has less difficulty? Like Merry is harder than Pippin. Merry's have to take 1 or 2 tricks, not zero or 3 or more. But Pippin's just take the fewest. And that's something people can understand. People can look at their hand and be like, oh, I have a bad hand. I'm taking Pippin. So a lot of the development work was like, we want, I'm rambling, but we want a smooth onboarding process to get to where the game originally started, which was the Fellowship, all the characters in the Fellowship. And obviously, if you know that it's a game through the whole book, that Fellowship chapter is actually kind of in the middle, a little past the middle. But, so what's cool is the development went from just this one game to now this like long chapter, mission-based, chapter-based thing where you get an onboarding to the original game, and then it goes beyond that and gets very hard and very different. And like I showed in this, unless you didn't watch it, no worries if you didn't, because you don't want full spoilers, but there's a post-campaign game, which is really fun. I'm so excited because this game, it grew into something so wonderful and so thematic and so interesting. Because a lot of the times was, part of the development was, once we were okay with being like, oh, let's go by chapters, then it was like this playground. It was like, oh, what do we want to do this chapter for? And I remember I would come up with some chapters and Brian would come up with some chapters, and it was really fun to be like, okay, I mean, again, not to do spoilers, but there's different characters, right, in different chapters. But you looked at a chapter, you're like, okay, who are these characters in this chapter? And it was so fun to read the Fellowship myself and go through and almost write down notes of like, okay, this character's in this chapter, and this character gets introduced in this chapter, and this is one of the new mechanics that we might want to try in this chapter, and play with that. So like I said about restrictions, it was really fun to go into, like Brian and I were talking, we're like, okay, we need a game for like this chapter. And we go into it and it'd be like, okay, well, these are 2 new characters, and like, let's focus around those 2 new characters. One of the developments was, when a character is new, make them required, which makes sense. If there's a new character, you really want them to be a part of it. That was part of it, where we would show off chapters where there was a new character, but they were optional. They weren't, asterisks required. And players sometimes wouldn't pick them. And it's like, oh, don't you want the new stuff to be always at the forefront and have players always see the new stuff? So that was a really fun part of the development. I'm just like rambling now. These are all just like fun development notes. I remember talking about how 3-player was much easier than 4-player. And part of the development also was just the difficulty balancing of the game. And this is before even 1 and 2 players were part of it. So we were designing for 4 and 3, and actually 5 for a little bit. And 5 was actually part of the end game, and it works. It's just a little bit much going on, so we actually kind of cut it. But so 3 and 4 players, so we would go through the entire game with 3 and 4 players in mind. But 3 was always easier than 4 because you have 1 less player, which is 1 less goal, and on top of that, you now have 3 more tricks in the game compared. So like at 4 players, it's 9 tricks. At 3 players, it's 12 tricks. So characters who needed to capture a bunch of cards or like do a certain object or whatever it needs to be were actually easier because they had more tricks to do them in. So 3-player was like double-pronged brutal. And the cool solution that we did was then we had double-sided characters. So if I show you, I know, again, no spoilers, this is just from the original set. If I show you Bilbo, Bilbo says, take 3 or more tricks, and on the back it's nothing because it's the same at both players. But Frodo is take 2 or more ring cards at 4, but then it's 4 or more ring cards at 3. And it's interesting because it's like, oh, it's just 2 more cards, but actually it goes from 40% of the rings to 80% of the rings, especially if one of them is cut. If a ring is cut at 3 players, you're like, Frodo, you're like, I need every ring, which is great. So that was a huge breakthrough in the development, was like, oh, different side characters. That is wonderful. And part of the levers that we were pulling became that. So if a 3-player was too easy, we're like, oh, let's make this character different at 3. So helpful. I've noticed there's some elements of that in development where if you need to tweak something, just having more levers is so awesome. The battery died. I forgot where I learned that from. I think it was Magic or Star Realms or something, but having multiple things you can tweak for balance is super helpful. Like if there's a cost for a card, or their power value, or their health, or their attack damage, and it's too strong, you can just lower one of those, right? Or too weak, you can raise one of those. And so it's awesome to have those levers. I think that also came in with the goals. So Frodo's is win 2 or more ring cards, and we were going back and forth like, oh, is that too easy? Is it too hard? Do we make it 3 or more? And I think a lot of the fun of development was like, how do we make someone the right amount of difficulty? So like Mary is win 1 or 2 tricks. And we're like, okay, like, is that easier or harder than 2 or 3 tricks, right? It was really fun to come up with that balance as well. So that was an interesting thing. As part of the production, I also noticed when I was showing it to players, since this is based around the books, and a lot of people who love the IP do love it for just the movies, or who haven't read the books but still love, Lord of the Rings. And I noticed I would show it to people, and since this is based on the books, there are book characters in here that were not a part of the movies. Spoiler. You could maybe guess, but anyway. So you would run into characters that people were like, who is this? What is going on? So one of the things I brought up was like, hey, is there a way to give players a little like context, or like a little bit of story somehow? Like, how can we do this? And Brian came up with such a wonderful thing. So we originally just had this, where it's like the chapter, the characters, victory, anything different, or any of the threat cards, which is something later. Whoops. But what was great was we weren't, using the back. And so on the back, it was like, oh, maybe there is where we can show players some context. And he's like, oh, what if we had a quote? This is one of my favorite things, is there's all these quotes from the book that perfectly encapsulate everything players are doing in such a fun way, or at least are like really fun little nods or winks to the context of what's going on. Like this one is like, when Bilbo Baggins of Bag End announced that he would shortly be celebrating his 11th birthday with a party of specials of magnificence, there was much talk and excitement in Hobbiton. Like, boom, this is what's happening. This is where we're at. Bilbo Baggins. I mean, there has to be some familiarity with what's going on, but this is so great because context. Because a lot of the times, especially in development, I would show people kind of out of order chapters, and people would be like, what is happening? Could you explain what is happening? Because like, it's like for the third one, okay, maybe I shouldn't do spoilers for the third one. For the first one, I would be like, okay, now we have, I don't even want to reveal any characters. You get the idea. So that was also really, really, really fun. All right, so spoiler alert. So that was the fun part of including the story and make it even more thematic, even though if you watched some of it, you'll notice that it does get more and more thematic in the gameplay. Definitely the first one is more of an intro, but as you get on, especially definitely later chapters, there's a lot more theme going on, and a lot more like, oh, this is definitely designed, this is a Lord of the Rings game, and I can't possibly see it being rethemed in any other way. What's really fun was working on the 1 and 2 player ways to play. So Brian came up with both of those, and they are so clever. I think, well, we definitely tweaked the pyramid. I remember the development work on the pyramid being very fascinating, because it was one of those things where, how do you not have it be too random, but still a surprise at 2 players? And Sean Ross has done a wonderful job of this with his Strawman games, and Vidrasso. Check out Vidrasso. It's a wonderful example. Where at 2 players, there's this hand, or like there's this face-up area that gets revealed as you play. So it's this idea of like drawing while playing a trick-taking, or hands changing. That is a good balance between, yes, definitely some randomness, or luck, or whatever it needs to be, but some planning and some working off that and some puzzliness there. There's a funny thing where trick-takers, they straddle this line of like puzzle and intuition and pushing your luck in kind of deduction. So I said like a lot of things there that weren't like straddling. It was like a seven-pronged thing. But the idea there is like sometimes a trick-taking game can feel like a puzzle, especially a co-op trick-taking game, where it's like Hanabi. It's like, here's this, puzzle out what it is. Or here's this clue and like figure out what's happening. 3 and 4 felt like a trick taker. So at 2-player, we wanted to make it still feel like a trick taker, but not too puzzly. The fun thing with the pyramid was it was all face up, then it was face down originally. And then it was like, it's too much of like a surprise. You're not kind of working toward it. So the fun part was choosing how many of the cards at the very top of the pyramid were face up. And we ended up 2 of the 3 because even though there's like that one center one that's really hard to get to and that one little kind of like final surprise, knowing more of where you're going with a hand helped with that long-term planning. So it felt more like a trick-taking game because you're like, okay, I want to like work toward playing this card or like kind of finagle my hand to be able to play this card. And that felt great. It was much less of a surprise. Also, the solo was fascinating. So Brian reached out and was like, hey, I have this idea for solo. Do you want to try it out? And I was like, yeah, sounds good. So I was actually on a plane and I was playing it on one of those trays in front of me. And I probably looked wild because I was playing a 4-handed solo game. But it was so much fun. Solo trick-taking is fascinating. We had a whole month of it on the channel. And games like Ek play off this idea of a draw, or like 4 Northwood, which is an amazing solo trick-taking game. That idea of the deck flipping, right? That randomness. You need that randomness. If you sat there with all the cards open, it's like, okay, I'm sure there is a trick-taking game with perfect information, but I think there's a surprise that the 3, 4, and even 2 players lends to a trick-taking game where you're like, I don't know everything. Like, let's try to eke it out. So at 1 player, you're like, well, how do I do that? So Brian came up with this wonderful system where you start with like half your hand essentially, and then when you play, you get a new card. And that's so wonderful. It's so interesting. It was so funny to have the game wasn't fully designed at that point, but having like pretty much the groundwork, and then going through it at 4, making sure it was super solid, going through it at 3, making sure the difficulty was there and making sure the options were still fun and players were doing similar things. And then at 2, it was like, oh, okay, there's some, peculiarities, but like this is kind of definitely working great at 2, with, maybe some caveats of like rules, like changes here or there. And then when 1 hit, it was like, whoa, here we go. So like the fact that, obviously not going to give spoilers, but there's certain chapters that playing at 1 player makes things very funny. So it was also really fun to play through the game again at 1 player and see it with fresh eyes. Because if you make something, if you write something, if you make music or like whatever, if you create something, you are in it, right? You're so ingrained in it, and you see it, you're so close to it, it's hard to see it from a different perspective. But what was amazing about 1 player was I got to play through the whole game, especially like full campaign, because I was just alone. As you know, being 1 person, it's easier to schedule than being 2, 3, 4 people. So I was able to play through the entire campaign super quickly and really get a sense of the whole breadth of it. But also, it was great to see from a different perspective. So that helped a lot, and that actually opened up things for like 3 and 4 player. And so it's really cool how in the development of a game, you're like, oh, let's see if a different player count can work, and that can impact other player counts. So that was like a big revelation. So that was great to do. But yeah, this game, I could talk for hours and hours and hours, so I'll try to limit myself. But it's so interesting that I've tried to do a development diary where you really only know 1 or 2 chapters. But in my head, as I'm talking, I'm just going through all of what I could say if you knew it all. I think there are so many interesting things in here, and maybe like in 6 months or something, and the game's been out for a while and people have a chance, I could do like a behind the scenes full development of this game, because there's chapters in here that from a development design perspective were so fascinating. I could rant about it. Last thing I'll say, besides the fact that I hope you have a wonderful time playing it, is that working with Brian on this was absolutely amazing. So 2 years ago or so, started working on it, and we've met weekly or so, and I at the time had not done too many development jobs, but now I have done a fair amount, And I've had a different experience with a lot of them, and sometimes I don't even talk to the designer. Sometimes, like I've never met them. Sometimes I work with them or go back and forth with them and get like their pulse when I'm doing development work on their design. Sometimes I will work on it all the way through, send it to the designer, see what they say, make some tweaks, and then have it go out the door. But this was working with Brian throughout, and it was so rewarding, so interesting. A lot of times I isolate a problem, come up with a solution, tell him about it, and it'd be like, oh, great, that works. And that's like, classic development, like, hey, this one character isn't very interesting, or like this one character isn't very strong. Let's tweak it this way. And talk to Brian, and he's like, yeah, sounds good. And then we would play, and it's like, works great, right? But then sometimes I'd be like, I have no clue how to change this character. Like, maybe it could do this, maybe it could do this. And then I'd bring it up to Brian, and Brian would be like, this. And it would be like, that is it. It was so fun. And so what's great is working with a designer this close is you get this like vision of a game that is so fun. And I know it definitely changed from all those years ago in PAX, where it was like this one, scenario, and now it's like this full book. I mean, if we have the whole book, we're going through the whole book now. But it's so cool because it's all these wonderful ideas mixed into this like cohesive narrative. And I know we have the foundation of the book to work off of, but it's so awesome to see like the complete package come together, especially working in like I'm just doing the development of it, so I'm not a part of like the art or whatever, but also like when I slowly got to see the art and how gorgeous it's not supposed to be a review, but how amazing, I'll say it, this artwork is that it came in. I just knew this whole product, this whole game was just something so special. So what's awesome is, and not to do again too much of a spoiler of future videos, but having this done and having this set and having this format has made it so when we've worked on Two Towers and Return of the King, that has gone super swimmingly. That has been so much fun to then get wilder and different in zanier, is because it's like, oh, so this was the start, this was the base format, this was such a solid foundation, now we can work off that. So it was interesting, and again, I'll talk about it later, but doing development work on Two Towers and Return of the King was also like a really fun jumping off point. So this just means a lot because it was such a good format, is what I was thinking of, that can do so much, as hopefully you'll see. So please let me know, send some thoughts, put some comments when you play, or messages, or whatever. It is very funny to not be able to talk fully of a game. This is a wild thing, but please play. Let me know how you find it. Favorite chapters, favorite characters, favorite moments. I definitely have my own. So yeah, maybe it'll be fun. Maybe in like 3 months or 6 months or something, I will make a call out for any thoughts, and we'll do like a fun little chat. I always love like the Watch It Played chats videos. So maybe something like that, because I truly want to hear any and all ideas, thoughts, what y'all have, especially because we're working on Two Towers and Return of the King. So if you have favorite things or fun stuff, like it'd be awesome to hear. So thank you so much for watching this long ramble. Thank you so much to Brian and everyone at Office Dog. It is just an absolute joy to work on this and be able to in any way be a part of the Lord of the Rings is wild. Going back to young Taylor taking peeks around the corner at the movie till now, it means a lot. So thank you so much for everyone at Office Dog, and Brian in particular. Just it means the world. And thank you so much for watching. Please enjoy it. Can't wait. Catch y'all later. And when you do, put a comment here or send me a message. I'd love to hear it. All right, thanks so much for watching. Bye.